This is Beyond with Heather Tesch, where we examine near-death experiences and life itself, hopefully making this life a little better. My guest today is Barbara Bartolome. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here with your guests.
Well, I am so excited to have you. There are so many things that I want to talk to you about, but let's start with your life right before your second near-death experience, and then we'll lead into your near-death experience.
Okay. Well, background a little bit that I was raised in Salem, Oregon, and I called that the Pacific Northwest. And I live in Santa Barbara now, so I'm happy about that. When I was growing up, I was really pretty much different than my peers. I adopted people, elderly people, poor or underprivileged kids in my school. I gave things away to people. And I really felt like I wanted to be a volunteer all the time, so I did a lot of volunteering in my community. I stood up against bullies. I was a big girl. I'm 5'9", and I protected weaker people. And it was interesting because nobody around me was doing the same kind of stuff, so I felt very isolated by that. I had a bunch of childhood events that didn't like connect with anyone around me, and I was looked at by my mom especially as just kind of like weird. And one of them was I was on a crosswalk with my mom waiting on a corner, and I was like 5 years old, and my little sister was there too, and she was holding onto her hands, and all of a sudden I broke her grip and I covered my face with my hands. And she was angry about that, and I said, "They're going to crash." And just after I said that, the car that was coming from behind us ran through the red light and crashed into the car that was in the intersection, and there was a big crunch and stuff. And my mom bent down and kneeled down, and she took my shoulders and she shook me, and she said, "Don't you ever tell anyone that you can do that." So it was scary to her that I was able to see things ahead of time. I had various precognition events through my childhood. When I grew up, at age 21, I married a person who I'd gone to high school with, but we hadn't really been friends in high school. We met afterwards, and that didn't work out. I had a son with that person, and that marriage did not work out. So at about age 24, I was divorced, and I ended up meeting someone in Oregon who was from Santa Barbara, California, and that person wooed me, and I ended up moving with my son down to Santa Barbara and married the person. But then I found that he was actually hiding the real him, and he was very abusive, and he was controlling and manipulative. And I was trapped in this situation and didn't want to tell my parents, of course, because I'd already had a divorce, and I'd made another mistake, and it was really rough on me, rough on my son. And what ended up happening was that person that I was married to ended up hurting my back so badly that he ruptured a disc in my lower spinal area, my L5-S1. So the first doctor that I went to see what I needed to do actually told me there wasn't anything that could be done to fix it, and that I would never walk again. I had lost my ability to walk. I had severe sciatica, and I couldn't walk. And at age 31, that was traumatic, and I didn't want to go with that. So I talked with friends of mine that were in the community, and they told me to go to a particular neurosurgeon here in Santa Barbara. So I went to that surgeon, and he put my x-rays and stuff up on a screen and kind of cockily said, "I can fix this." I really wanted to believe that. I'm 31 years old and I want to walk again. So he scheduled surgery in December of 1987. And my little daughter had been born that July, so she was only about 5 months old when the surgery occurred, and my son was about 8 years old. And they wanted me to go into the hospital prior to the surgery being done the next day. They wanted to do one final test, which was called a myelogram. And the myelogram is done at the hospital in an x-ray room. They inject iodine dye, and in my case, they did it right in the back of my neck back there. and they had me laying on an x-ray table. They were going to watch the iodine dye go down my spinal cord and see if there were any leaks in the spinal cord, because if the disc had blown and a fragment had chipped the spinal cord, they needed to do more than what they had planned to do, which was a laminectomy discectomy. So they had me on the table, and the x-ray techs said, you cannot move whatsoever during this procedure, because if you do, you could end up with headaches for months afterwards. So I'm not going to move. Both the both the neurosurgeon and the orthopedic surgeon were in the room, the 2 x-ray techs and 1 nurse. And after they injected the dye in, they started to tip the table, and it was just the 2 x-ray techs that were dealing with the situation. The doctors weren't watching yet, because they were talking, leaning against a wall and talking to each other. And the nurse was over by the door where there was another desk area. And I started feeling, the minute they started tipping the table and I heard the of the engine of the table, I started feeling really funny. And I thought, oh, am I supposed to be feeling like this? This is so weird. And the 2 guys were talking to each other, and they were talking about their weekend plans. They weren't really paying attention to what was happening to me on the table. So I didn't interrupt right away. I thought, well, maybe I'm supposed to feel like this. I felt like I was going to faint. And then finally, when I realized, 20, 30 seconds in, that I needed to say something, I actually couldn't speak, and I couldn't raise my hand to touch him to get his attention. So I was pretty much stuck laying there, and the table's moving, and what they were doing was, by accident, he had pushed the wrong button on the table, and he was lowering my head instead of raising it. So the dye that was supposed to go down my spinal cord and down and lower into my back was going into my brain. I asked a neurosurgeon years later what that would do to someone, and he said, well, the dye going into your brain would change the pressure in your brain, which would cause dysfunction in a lot of your procedures of your brain. And so I had already had my eyes rolling back, and at the point where I got to the worst part of it, I started hyperventilating, and I couldn't control my breathing, and I was breathing really fast. And that's what caused the 2 x-ray techs to stop talking and look at me. So the guy who was pushing the button, kind of leaned over my face, saw my eyes rolling to the back of my head, saw me hyperventilating. Then he leaned back, and the last thing that I saw, in trying to keep my eyes forward, I could still see stuff. He looked at where his finger was on the side of the x-ray table, and he then made this face like, like, oh no. And that was the last thing I saw. Then literally shut my eyes in my body, and the next second I was up on the ceiling, and it felt like the ceiling was against the back of my head. I was looking straight down at the table, at my body, and I didn't feel panicked or anything that I had felt in my body was gone. I felt wrapped in a warm blanket, loved, accepted. I felt so incredible. It was beautiful. And I looked down and very calmly said, if I'm up here and my body's down there and he's calling code blue, I think I just died. And it wasn't any panic whatsoever. The second that I said that, I realized there was someone next to me on my left side, and I didn't ever look to see if there was any vision or any shape or light or anything like that. I knew who that was. Internally, I felt connected to whoever that was prior to my whole entire life. I felt like it was what you would say God was. So I wasn't at all scared. I felt this beautiful connection, and I began talking to him through my thoughts. And I said, I really need to go back into my life. If I leave my children in this way at this time, they won't grow up to be the good human beings that they're capable of being because of the abuse that they'll suffer. I need to protect them. I need to go back, please. May I please go back? And so I said that about 4 times as they were doing all this stuff down below. They were doing CPR. One of the x-ray techs was blowing in my mouth. The other one was doing the chest compressions. The lady over at the table by the door was calling for the defib unit and saying, "Stat!" She called for an oxygen cart. They brought the oxygen cart and they connected the oxygen mask up to my face, so they stopped doing the breathing into my mouth, but they had the oxygen mask on my face. And they were still doing the chest compressions. They were switching off about every 2 minutes or so. And this guy came in and he brought in a box and he put it on the shelf that was next to the table that I was laying on. And he was standing in between the shelf and the table. And he was peeling these white things that were circular, and he was peeling the backs of them. And I didn't know what he was doing at all. I understood everything else. But I stopped, like, in the midst of talking to the being that I had next to me. And I said, "What is that he's doing?" And when I said that, I was moved down to right in front of the box. And I literally watched his hand go across, in front of my consciousness to the box. And he flicked a toggle switch. And then this light in the box, in this green rectangular area at the top of the box, lit up. And it started going in a straight line across the screen. Well, I had never seen a heart monitor. I didn't know what it was. And I didn't watch TV, and so I was like, "What is that?" And so I was trying to figure that out as I was watching the little white light go across the green screen and in the straight line. And it went across once, it went across twice, and the third time it started to go across, all of a sudden, about a third of the way over, I went, oh, that's supposed to be going up and down. That's a heart monitor, and my heart's not beating. And the second I thought that, then I was back up on the ceiling again with the being next to me. So again, I asked if I could please go back. And the neurosurgeon said to the orthopedic surgeon, "Too much time has passed. She's going to be brain dead. We need to do something." And the orthopedic surgeon said, "Stand clear." And so everybody that was standing on his side of the table stepped back and away. And he took 2 steps forwards. He took his fist from behind his back, he arced it over his head, and he pounded my chest. And I found out years later that that's called a precardial thump. They do that in a last-ditch effort to restart a heart by a shock when they can't get the defib unit in to do the shock. And so it very rarely works. And it didn't work in that moment because up on the ceiling I watched him hit me. And then the being that was next to me spoke to me. And in this beautiful, beautiful voice that was just so gentle and loving and kind, it said, "But if you go back, you'll still be in your marriage. What will you do?" And showed me all these film clips that just went flash, 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 flash across the screen. And it was all of the incidents that my husband had been pushing me, shoving me, kicking me, berating me. All the different things that he'd done were all flashed. And I remembered up there every one of those incidents. As it flashed, I remembered every one of them. So then I was given time to think about my decision, and I thought about all the things that I had done to try to help him change out of his anger issues. It had related to his father and his early childhood, and I had, suggested a marriage family therapist, and after 3 or 4 sessions, he rejected that. I suggested a pastor of a church. Again, he rejected. I wrote him letters. I left him for a year and moved out and told him when he got counseling that I would, possibly come back. He assured me that he'd gotten counseling after a year, and he begged me to come back, and I moved back in and found that he was still the same person. And so I had done everything I could think of to help him change. And so I realized up on the ceiling that it wasn't him that should change. It was me. That I should stop accepting his behaviors and stop trying to change him and just get out of the situation. So I said to the being, "If you let me go back, I promise you I'll get strong enough to leave him," because I realized that the 7 years that I'd been married to him had really diminished my personal power, and I was afraid of him severely. And I needed to do something to strengthen myself, to get myself to the point where I could get out of there safely with my children. So that happened. I got away. I got safely away, and it ended up, you know, being this NDE ended up being the critical thing in my life that helped me to get out of that situation, because I knew I had promised in that moment up above my body that I would get strong enough to leave him. So that was the power that I needed to figure out a way to do that. And I did that in my life, and I got away. That was pretty amazing. After the NDE occurred, when I got back into my body again, the doctor did a second precardial thump right after I had said that. And what ended up happening was that the second precardial thump restarted my heart. And when I shut my eyes up on the ceiling and opened them again, the doctor had his fist right here on my chest, and he was just standing, arm's length away from me. And I had the oxygen mask on my face, and I looked at him and I said, "What just happened?" And the nurse leaned over me and said, "Stop, don't talk, we need to stabilize you." So for 20 minutes, they did whatever they had to do. And then they finally took the oxygen mask off. And I looked at the doctors that were standing next to the table and all these people that were in the room, like 7 people, 8 people in the room. And I said, "What just happened?" I was just up on the ceiling and I was watching everything that was being done down here. What happened? And the neurosurgeon, he goes, "Oh, brother." And that made me want to validate it completely. So then I immediately started saying what each person had been doing or saying in this time that I had been dead. About 8 to 10 minutes is what I estimate. And so that shocked everybody. And the neurosurgeon got so freaked out that he pulled his fists up next to his body and he went, "I'm not going to stand here and listen to this." And he stormed out of the room. And then the orthopedic surgeon, he was really nice. He took my hand and he said, "Tell me, how did it feel? What was it like?" And he was interested in the whole thing, and everybody stood there and listened to it all. But then no one in the whole hospital, they sent me up to my room for staying overnight so that they could do the surgery the next day. And not a single person that came in my room or the doctors the next day when they approached me in the recovery area, I said, "What happened last night?" And the neurosurgeon held his hand up and said, "I am not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about your surgery." So no one would talk to me about it. Obviously, they recognized it was a medical error that had been done, and they didn't want the lawsuit situation. And of course, I didn't have any support system to do a lawsuit at all, so I did not sue anybody. When I told my now ex-husband the next day after he came to the hospital what had happened the night before, he said, "Oh, that couldn't have happened. You probably hallucinated that." Well, I don't do drugs. I never did. I don't drink alcohol. I've held a security clearance with the Department of Defense, a secret classification, which is pretty hard to get. And I have a completely clean background because my mom used to say she was going to shoot my butt off if I ever did anything wrong. So I was like, "Yep, I'm going to be a good girl." So no hallucinations in my past, and I'm pretty sure that was not a hallucination. I'm absolutely sure, in fact. So it was interesting to have it happen. It changed my life completely. It got me, strong enough to leave him. It was incredible to contribute towards me. I think that was planned. I think that's why they put me into that situation. Whoever it is on the other side, like if you want to say it's God, because I believe that's who it is, I think they planted it, and I think that changed, the whole situation for my life. I ended up being single for a couple years, and then I ended up marrying someone who's my husband now. We've been married 30 years, and we have, kids that love each other and a happy life, and we're in Santa Barbara, and it's just really great. So one thing that happened though, after all this had gone on and I'd gotten married and had been married for a number of years, when I was about 55, my brother was going to dinner with us up in Oregon, and I had been to an IANDS conference, which is International Association for Near-Death Studies, and that's a group that's worldwide that has education and support for near-death experiencers. And I had been to a conference, and I had talked with a lady named PMH Atwater, and she had talked at the conference about the after effects that people have that they've done research on. University of Virginia, Division of Perceptual Studies, Bruce Grayson, they've done tons of research on near-death experiencers. And she was talking about the after effects, and I, at her talk, thought, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense to me, because the after effects that she's explaining, such as intuition and like you don't age the same way that other people age, and like I still have 20/20 vision and perfect hearing, and my hair is still my color. I've never dyed it, and I'm 66 years old. So there are aspects of it that I could see that had applied to me, and all the way back, some of the things all the way back to my early childhood. And it was like, what? Wait a minute, I had my NDE at age 31. Why would I have some of these after effects all the way back? So I was talking with her, and she took my hand. She was so dear, and she said, I think that you should talk with your family to see if you had a previous near-death experience in your early life that you don't recall. And I thought at the time, oh brother, they think that I've had more than one of these things. Oh my gosh. And I didn't know what to do with that information at all, but I was going to see my oldest brother. He's 10 years older than me. We were going to go to dinner. And so what I thought about ahead of time is I don't want to tell him about my near-death experience because I'd never told my family about it. But what I want to do is figure out if something else happened earlier in life. So I said, Brad, I'm going to make this little booklet thing that I'm going to put in my purse with all of my vaccinations and my, things that had happened in my life medically, so that in case I'm ever in a car accident or something, they've got that information in there. And so I said, is there anything that you can remember other than this incident and that incident when I was really young? Can you remember anything else that happened to me that I should put in the book? And we were going to dinner, and we went into the restaurant. He said, no, I can't think of anything, but I'll think about it, and I'll let you know. So after the restaurant, we were outside all talking with his wife and his daughter and my husband and I. And he took my hand and he said, Barb, there is something I thought about that I need to tell you. And I always felt like I should talk to you about it, but the parents had said not to mention it ever to you. And he said, I think I should tell you. When you were 18 months old, you died. And I was like, what? And he goes, yeah. He said, you had a really high fever. You were sick with something. I don't remember what it was. He said, you had a high fever. You went into convulsions and you stopped breathing. And he said, Dad called the fire department, which was what 911 was back in 1958. And they had advised my dad to tell my mom, who was holding me, to put me in tepid bath water, to fill the bathtub up with just, tepid water, not hot, not cold, and then to slowly add ice cubes, and that they were sending the ambulance over, but that would help cool my body down without putting me into shock, because if you take a person who's in a situation like that and put them in really cold water, their body will go into shock. And that's another incident that they don't want to have to deal with. So my brothers both ran over to the neighbors' houses to get more ice. My mom was filling the bathtub up with tepid water and she had me in the tub, and my brother came back with the ice. He said he stood in the doorway, handed my mom the bag of ice, and he was watching the whole thing. He said, you had, in the time that he had been gone and had come back again, he said you were soft purple. And he said that you were lifeless, you were not breathing. And he said mom was holding on to you, and your head was above the water temperature, the water level. And then mom started adding the ice cubes, and she was crying and sobbing over the top of you. And he said, as I was watching, you came back to life. He said, all of a sudden, you arched your back backwards, threw your head back, and he said you took in this deep breath, and then you burst into tears. And he said you went from purple to bright red again in a flash of a second, because you were still very feverish, your body. So, the ambulance people came and they took me off to the hospital, and my older sister remembers the event as well. So that happened when I was 18 months old. I don't remember it at all, but I had all of these after effects all through my childhood, which were kind of freaky to other people and freaky to myself as well, because I didn't know why I had the skills that I had. So it's been an interesting life. I feel happy that I've figured it out with the near-death experience information. I feel um, guided from the other side very much by what happened to me, and I constantly say to them, I am ready to go home whenever you want me to come home, but until then, I want to do your work. So I've done tons and tons of volunteer work in our community here in Santa Barbara. I was recognized by the University of California, Santa Barbara, as what they call an unsung heroine for all of the volunteer work that I've done. I was busy with a store that I started downtown in Santa Barbara, which I had for 6 years in Santa Barbara, and they named me Businesswoman of the Year for that store here in Santa Barbara. I've had all of these amazing experiences that I see planted by the near-death experience and the connection that I have to the other side. Because when I started that store, for example, I was working at the University of California, Santa Barbara, loved my job in the Graduate School of Education. And one day I woke up in the morning and I was waking up my son, who was in third grade. Our youngest child was in third grade at that time. We had 5 altogether. My husband's 2 from his previous marriage, my 2 from my previous marriage, and the baby that we had together. And I was waking up the youngest. And as I walked through our living room after waking him up, I had this feeling of a grip happening on the top of my head, and it felt like 2 hands were, grabbing the back of my head back here. And I thought, what? Am I having a stroke? What's going on? And I stopped in the living room. My husband was clear through the house and, not anywhere where he was close by. And the kids were, just waking up, so they weren't anywhere near me at all either. And I thought, I'm probably having a stroke. Oh no. And I was freaking out. And all of a sudden, this big voice said in my living room, you will have a scrapbook store. And that's the weirdest thing in the world for me to hear, because I did not scrapbook and I didn't really know how to create a retail store. But what happened was I looked up at the ceiling and I said, God, are you talking to me? Because I think you might have the wrong house, wrong neighborhood. I don't have any clue as to what you're telling me to do. So what, And there was no answer. So then I went running through the house to my husband. I said, you'll never believe what just happened in the living room. Told him the whole thing. And he looked, my husband is 7 feet tall. He's an ex-NBA basketball player for Golden State Warriors. He's really tall. So I'm looking up at him and he looks down at me and he goes, well, I think that if you got that big of a message, you should see what it's going to take to get you there. And I'm like, what? We have 5 kids. We've got, 2 in college right now. We've got 1 more heading to college next year. We don't have any kind of money to do a retail store. I don't even want to do a scrapbook store. Why would I want to do that? Like, I'm just kind of completely blowing it out of the water. And he looks down at me and I think he's going to say something. And I'm looking at him and his mouth opens, and instead of Victor's voice, it was the voice from the living room. And the voice said, Barbara, you're the one that received the message. And I just went, and Victor saw me do that, and I went in and sat down, and I was literally just shaking. My hands were shaking. And I didn't tell him what I had seen at that point, and I ended up going to work late that day, and I got off work early because I'd already scheduled to get off at noon. And when I got down into my car and drove to Santa Barbara, there was a different voice in the car that at a stoplight that was right before my bank said, the voice said, you need to stop and ask about a business loan. And I'm like going, oh my God. And I'm thinking, should I listen to this? Should I just bypass the bank? What should I do? But I thought, I need to listen to it. I need to trust it. So I went into the bank and I asked a teller, who do I talk to about a business loan? I had no idea. And she pointed out this person to me, and he ended up talking to me and asking me what I wanted to use the business loan for and how much did I want to borrow. And the absurdity of me not being able to answer how much did I want to borrow? How would I know how much to borrow? I had no idea. He got a little bit irritated with me because I didn't have the answer, and I felt embarrassed that I'd even, approached the situation. So I said, I'm really so sorry for taking your time today. I'll come back when I've got, more plans in place. Thank you so much for your help today. And I started to walk through the bank, and I was just going to leave and not, think about doing the scrapbook store. And the voice from the car said, now, wait a minute. You cannot give up that easily. You need to go back and ask someone else. And I'm in the middle of the bank going, oh, God, you're not making it easy on me. Tell me who I'm supposed to ask. So as I'm walking out of the bank, there are 4 people that I was going to walk through this corridor of glass-walled cubicles. And I looked at each person as I walked through thinking, well, maybe they'll give me a sign that they're the person I'm supposed to talk to. And indeed, the 4th person that I looked at was a young man who was 32 years old. I just glanced at him. He was writing something on his desk on a paper. And the second I glanced at him, he looked up like this and he went like this, like he knew me. I didn't know him from Adam. And so I backed up and thought, oh, I guess I have to talk to him. And so I told him that I wanted to, think about doing a loan with the bank for this, store that I wanted to open. And so he was talking about how all the aspects of the business loan are and what I needed to do to create that and blah, blah, blah. And then after he had talked to me for about 10 minutes, he was looking at the computer the whole time while he was doing that. And he said, Mrs. Bartolome, can you hold on for just a moment? I'll be right back. And I said, sure. So I was sitting in his little cubicle, and he went back down 2 cubicles. They all had glass walls. He was talking to a lady and looking at her computer, maybe 4 minutes worth of time. And then he walked back towards me, and I got up and grabbed my purse and said, are we ready to go? Are we done? And he said, Mrs. Bartolome, you've been approved for a $250,000 loan to start your store. And I'm like going, I hadn't filled anything out. What? And so I said, he goes, do you want to come in tomorrow and sign paperwork for that? And I was totally so blown away. I said, do you mind if I call my husband? And he said, no, not at all. So I called my husband. He also worked at the university too. And I said, you know what I was talking to you about this morning? Well, I'm at the bank and they want to give me, $250,000 to start that store. What do you think? Do you want to move forward and come in tomorrow and sign paperwork for that? And he said, sure. What time? He didn't even question anything. He moved forward with me. We came in the next morning, signed paperwork. I opened my store, and 6 months later, I was named Businesswoman of the Year for Santa Barbara. I had it for 6 years. It was such a wonderful spot. But, things end. It ended because of the recession in 2009. But almost immediately, I found the IANDS world, which, was my near-death experience stuff. And I opened the IANDS organization here in Santa Barbara, which we've been doing for 12 years now. And we have monthly meetings that not only educate people about near-death experiences, and we bring all experiencers to Santa Barbara and they talk in front of our groups, or we also support the near-death experiencers that report to us that they've had one, give them, ways to acclimate to their near-death experience. So I can see how things were planned. I don't know that I planned them, but I'm going along for the ride, and it's been a really beautiful one, and I really am appreciative of everything that's happened.
Well, Barbara, it's such an incredible story, and I have so much more that I want to talk to you about, but let's take that into part 2.
Okay.
Just a quick note for any of you that may be in an abusive relationship like Barbara was. I want to recommend a book. I'm not getting anything for this, but this was written by a dear friend of mine, Christy Paul. It's called Love Isn't Supposed to Hurt, and it may really help you out. So I'll put a link in the description.
Thanks so much for joining me on Beyond with Heather Tesch. That was part 1. Make sure to listen to part 2. And if you liked what you heard, please hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for more episodes.